We know God to the extent that he reveals himself, and, of course, to the extent that our finite nature allows, right? So there may be things about God, I think clearly there are, that we just can't grasp given our nature, or things about God that he has not yet, perhaps, revealed to us. It's important to note that God is not a being like other created beings, right? There's a creator-creature distinction that has to be acknowledged and maintained. God is the source of all other beings. All other beings derive their existence, their being, from God. But God derives his existence and his being from no one. He is self-existent. In order to sort of understand some of that a little more deeply and who God is, what he has revealed about himself, it's nice to look at the various sort of doctrines or features or attributes of God and consider them separately. Now, as we do this, I want you to sort of be aware that at least according to the dominant traditional understanding of God in the Christian tradition, these are not actually distinct features of God, right? These are all, God in himself is a perfect unity. He doesn't have features somehow sort of glued to him or stuck to him or that are somehow distinct from who he is. But it's still, given our finitude, the only way we can sort of understand and talk about God is by distinguishing them. Okay. The first doctrine to be considered is the doctrine of aseity, divine aseity. And the idea here is this doctrine tells us that, or this feature tells us that God is wholly and completely independent of everything. He is indeed the only fully, completely independent being in the universe. And the doctrine of divine aseity, it implies that God is simple. And so this is the doctrine of divine simplicity. Now, simplicity here is not the sense that God is somehow slow or dumb, but it's the sense that God is not a bundle or a bundle of features or a collection of parts or whatever. The doctrine of divine simplicity says God has no parts, no composition. There's no potentiality in God. He's fully actual, right? He's not like, potentially loving and waiting to love until there are other beings to love. No, he's fully actually loving. And this doctrine grows out of, it follows from the doctrine of divine aseity, because if God had features that were distinct from himself, or if God had parts, then God would depend on those things. Think of it like this. Just as I depend on the parts that make me, God would depend on the parts that make him, right? So I have various parts, right? I have, I've got my head part, my torso part, my leg parts, and so on and so forth. These are different, distinct parts, and I depend on them, or at least some of them, continuing to exist in order for me to continue to exist. The idea is that type of dependency is not possible with God because he's completely independent. So divine aseity means that God is completely, radically independent of everything, and so God is partless. That's the idea of divine simplicity. Divine simplicity implies that God is eternal, in the sense that God is timeless. God does not exist in time. He's not getting older. He doesn't have a past or a future. Why does divine simplicity imply the timelessness of God? Well, because the idea would be that if God were in time, then he'd have temporal parts. And since God is simple, he's partless, he can't have temporal parts, so he has to exist outside of time altogether. Now, it is important for me to note that some Christians do think that God is eternal, but by being temporally eternal. And so the idea is that time is infinitely extended in the past and the future direction, and that God exists at every moment of those times. But the traditional doctrine is that God is timelessly eternal. Divine simplicity also implies that God is immutable, right? It implies that God is unchangeable. Think of it like this: since God has no parts or features that are distinct from him, there's no possibility for God to change in any way. When I or you change, we undergo a kind of alteration in our parts or features. We go from sitting to standing, from being hungry to being full, from having 10 fingers to having 9, blah, blah, blah. Those are changes in our features or parts. So for something to change in some way, it has to have features or parts. Divine simplicity says God doesn't have any. God doesn't have either of those things. So God can't change. Change is not possible. Now, the Bible does seem to say that God changes, but most interpreters throughout history believe that such language is metaphorical. The reason they think this is because the Bible also says that God doesn't change, indeed that he can't change. So, either the Bible is contradictory, it asserts that God both changes and does not change, or the Bible's not contradictory at all, and we need to figure out what it is telling us. Now, this is a really important point here. Charging anything, any book you're reading, or anyone, any person you've encountered or have a relationship with an outright contradiction, that should actually be our last move, not our first one. Whether you're reading Plato or Aristotle, or listening to your mom or a friend, you should not immediately charge them with a contradiction when they say things that seem inconsistent. You should probe further. That's what love requires of us. And it is certainly true of our reading of the Bible. And it's not hard to see that there is, in fact, no real contradiction when the Bible seems to say that God both changes and does not change. The passages that seem to suggest change are passages that reflect our perceptions of God. Since our perceptions of God are changing, it appears that God himself is changing, but that doesn't follow. It's obviously possible for something to appear to change because of a change in the perceiver without there being a real change in the thing perceived. To give just a simple example, consider what happens when you look at a tall building from a great distance and what happens when you look at that same building up close. It appears that the height and size of the building have changed. But of course, they didn't. You did. So with respect to God, the doctrine of immutability states that God, as he is in himself, cannot change, but it can appear to us that God is changing since we are constantly changing. Omniscience. The doctrine that God is omniscient is just simply the claim that God knows all things. He knows every truth, that it is true, of every falsehood, that it is false. There is no fact, there is no event that is somehow outside of God's knowledge. God is omnipotent. That is, he's all-powerful. He has full power. Right? This, by the way, you can see it articulated or displayed in the traditional doctrine of creation, and in particular, creation ex nihilo, the idea that God brings all of the universe into existence by speaking it. Next, the doctrine that God is omnipresent, the doctrine of omnipresence. Now, I like to think of this doctrine in terms of omniscience and omnipotence. That is, God is everywhere, according to the doctrine of omnipresence, which means something like there's no place, there's no location where God is somehow absent. How should we understand that, since God isn't a material being? Well, we understand it in terms of omniscience and omnipotence. God's knowledge and power extend to everything. Everything that exists because God brought it into existence and upholds it in existence. And God knows everything happening everywhere. So that's what it means for God to be omnipresent. God is sovereign. All of the above features that I just articulated, divine aseity, divine simplicity, omniscience, omnipotence, immutability, eternality, imply that God is sovereign. He is in complete control. He's not caught off guard. He does not have to adjust his plans based on some unexpected event in the universe. No, everything that exists, everything that happens in the universe ultimately depends on him. God is good. God's perfect goodness can be thought of in terms of God's being love and loving, just and justice, holy and righteous. It can also be thought of in terms of God's simplicity. The doctrine of divine simplicity states that God has no parts whatsoever, which implies that God cannot change. God is completely and fully actual. There is no potentiality in him. There is nothing in God that is waiting to become actualized. Being fully actual implies being fully good. Bad things are things that are failing in some way. Bad eyes are eyes that fail to do or be what eyes are supposed to do or be. They are unable to carry out their function properly. Or put differently, they are unable to actualize one or more of their distinctive traits. My eyes are really bad because they fail to do what eyes are supposed to do. Since God is fully actual, there's nothing in God that is supposed to be actual yet isn't. There is nothing in God that can possibly fail to do what it is supposed to do. So God is completely good. But now, this gives rise to a serious worry. If God really is completely and perfectly good and omnipotent and omniscient and all those other things, then why is there so much badness in the world? We will address this issue next time.